Hey, everybody, and welcome to today's episode on Let's Talk About Pools with Eric Knight from Orenda. He's going to be talking about winterization of pools the Orenda way. And I want to say thank you so much, Patriot Pool Heating, for being the sponsor of this particular podcast episode today. If you're up in the Northeast or anywhere, he's going to be able to help you out with your pool heating needs. Help you save money. So please check out Patriot Pool Heating, go to their website, and please check out their sponsored ad before we get to hear from Eric Knight today. So enjoy, guys. And again, thank you, Patriot Pool Heating.
Is the amount of money that costs to run your pool every month killing you? Well, watch this video. So as a pool owner, you know that one of your most expensive monthly bills during the summer is your pool. Between electric and heating, we can save you a tremendous amount of money with variable speed pumps and with high efficiency heaters. And now with COVID going on, you're going to look for an extended season. So if you want to save money and extend your season to get the most out of your pool, call the experts at Patriot Pool Heating.
Welcome, everybody, to my podcast today. Let's talk about pools. And my podcast guest today is Eric Knight. He's VP of Business Development with Orenda. Welcome, Eric. How are you?
Hi, Lauren. Thanks for having me.
And what are we going to be talking about today, Eric?
Well, I've been asked to come on here and talk about anything that you want to talk about, but I guess today's topic is winterization.
Yeah, I think we were going to talk about winterization of pools and you with the Orenda, what Orenda feels is the best way to winterize pools. So let's get right into it.
Yeah, let's go.
What kind of problems occur if you don't winterize your pool properly?
That's the $1 million question, right? We get a lot of phone calls at Orenda and a lot of emails, a lot of requests from customers and homeowners that have problems in the springtime when they open up their pools. They either don't know what it's from or it's something that we're not expecting. So let's go back in time. Years and years ago, people had grown accustomed to opening up their pools in the spring to scale. And I'm using air quotes when I say scale, because things would turn white and it'd be sharp and it'd look like either 10 grit sandpaper or very sharp, almost tentacles coming out of the plaster. And, when you see calcium deposits, you think scale, everybody does. Discolorations, you'd have like midnight blue pigmented cement finishes turning ghost gray. Or sometimes there would be white dust everywhere when you'd open it up. And we've got pictures of all these conditions. And everyone got used to thinking, oh, this is scale. Scale came out of solution and we need to change our winterization habits. The problem was they thought it was scale. It is not scale. Scale is an oversaturation of calcium carbonate in your water. And the analogy that I use for this is I've got my drink here. It's just water. But if I add sugar to this and I stir it around, that sugar will dissolve. If I add more sugar, it will also dissolve. But at some point, I add too much sugar to it. And Lauren, what happens to that sugar?
It's not going to dissolve anymore, correct?
No matter what, I could shake it for an hour. It'll still fall to the bottom, right?
Yep.
Why?
Because it's oversaturated?
Exactly right. The water can't hold any more sugar. Replace the word sugar with calcium carbonate, and that's the LSI. The Langmuir Saturation Index tells us how saturated water is with calcium carbonate. 0.0 on the LSI is perfect saturation. That's equilibrium. That's where the water wants to be. And if you're close enough, i.e. minus 0.3 to positive 0.3, you're in that window, that margin of error that your water's happy, you're not going to etch, you're not going to form scale. Well, scale is a high LSI violation, meaning you've got too much sugar in your drink, you've got too much calcium carbonate. And if you want to forensically look at how that happens, well, it's very obvious if it's scale versus something else. And the reason for that is scale has to start from the water, meaning it lands on things. And it always lands and precipitates in the highest LSI areas first. Usually that's temperature driven. Okay. First place that scales on a salt pool is the salt cell. Heat and a high pH generated. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily generate when the water is flowing through that cell at 60 gallons a minute or whatever it is. It's usually right when it shuts off. And now you've got stagnant water in a hot cell with a high pH sitting there, and it has more time to actually form scale. So if you have those salt flaking issues, that's usually where that comes from. So a simple pattern to that is program your pump to keep running 5 to 10 minutes after the salt cell shuts down, and you'll flush all that stuff out. You'll cool down the salt cell. The next thing is heaters. And that's what we're talking about today. So heaters get scaled up simply because of heat. Heat raises the LSI. So the hotter the water is, the more likely it is to precipitate. And this is an important distinction to make. Lauren, if you wanted to dissolve more sugar, what could you do to that water? We had the same amount. It's not going into solution. What can we do to that water? There's a few options, right? One of the things we could do is dilute, right? We could drink half of it and fill it with non-sugar water, and then you change the saturation again. But in cooking, you actually heat up water. If you're making sweet tea, it's hot water that you're adding sugar in because the temperature allows you to dissolve more sugar. It's the opposite with calcium. Calcium dissolves better in cold water. That's why when your temperature gets brought down, you're less likely to have scale formation. The LSI goes down. Temperature down, LSI. We just have to remember that calcium, and I believe magnesium too, but focus on calcium. Calcium is unlike just about anything else that dissolves in water. The colder, the better, which means when the water temperature gets colder, i.e. in the winter, it needs more calcium. So the problems we were seeing that looked like scale were not scale at all. Because I'm sitting with a customer and he's describing this and he's showing me pictures, and I'm seeing all these marks between tile, like only on the grout, or I'm seeing it around fittings, but not on the fittings. I'm seeing it only coming out of cement, not on aggregate. Scale can't do that. Scale comes from the water and lands on everything.
Yep.
If it were scale, it would be on the light. It would be on the plastic fitting. It would be on the face of the tile. But that's not what was happening here. This stuff was coming out of the plaster. That was a huge paradigm shift in my mind to recognizing these colder climates, particularly the Northeast, has been taught for many years that they have a scale problem. And it's the exact opposite of scale. They don't have enough calcium going into the wintertime. So you asked me what problems can occur from bad winterization. Well, the vast majority of them are going to be LSI related. It's going to be a calcium issue if you have a plaster type pool. And I say plaster type, anything with cement in it, pebble, quartz, plaster, you name it. If you have a vinyl liner or fiberglass pool, the problems are a little bit different. You still have an LSI violation, but since you don't have nearly as much calcium carbonate in the case of vinyl liners, which by the way, do have calcium carbonate in them, I've recently found out, fiberglass has none. So what water's going to do is it's just going to be furious. It's going to be hungry for calcium. It's going to start gnawing away at these surfaces looking for calcium. In the case of a gel coat on fiberglass, we're learning it'll break down the gel coat over time. And then once you get through that, chlorine can actually oxidize it and it starts turning white. And that's what we call chalking. It originated as an LSI violation. And a lot of people will tie that to just having a low pH. It's not necessarily just a low pH. It's a low LSI. In vinyl liners, you're going to have fading and increased porosity. And over time, that can lead to wrinkling, cracking, all these other things. And I've been just doing a ton of research on this from CGT, which is one of the original vinyl manufacturers. It's pretty incredible, the research that they've done on vinyl materials. But vinyl and fiberglass really don't have the mechanism for water to correct itself. Plaster pools do. So what you'll see in those plaster pools is you will see the loss of calcium and then the reformation of calcium when the LSI gets oversaturated again. For instance, winter dust. The water was hungry. You didn't winterize with enough calcium. Give me a calcium hardness number that's typical that you think most people would be winterizing, Lauren. I know you're in Florida, so.
Yeah, it's hard to say in Florida because we're year round. I would say they might want to winterize at 200.
Most people would think that. In fact, a lot of them were saying, I need less than 200 because they don't want scale, even though they were wrong. It wasn't scale. It just looked like scale, right? Well, if you winterize at 200, and that's not enough, shortcut. If your pool freezes, that's not nearly enough calcium. But that water is going to get hungrier and hungrier and hungrier as you get into October, November, and December. And eventually that water is going to get to its lowest point. Let's say December. It had to etch a little bit here and there gradually as the temperature continued to drop when that pool was winterized. And perhaps you had a cover on the pool, and I think we're going to discuss covers a little bit later here.
Yep.
But it had to etch its way down. Now, when it etches, it pulls out calcium hydroxide, which has a high pH of 12.6. That pH spikes in your pool, but the LSI stays balanced. And the reason for that is it's just trying to reach equilibrium, and then it stops eating. Everything's good. If you were to open up the cover in late December, that water would actually look pretty clear. You wouldn't see any scale. You wouldn't see any crystals. You wouldn't see any dust. But then spring rolls around, and now the temperature starts going up again. And pretty soon, you're not 32 degrees anymore when your pool was frozen. You're at 40, and then 50 degrees, and then 60 degrees. And now you've got another LSI violation. So by the time that pool cover gets pulled off in April, let's say, or early May, your water has come up another 20 to 30 degrees, and now there's dust everywhere. Because now you do have scale. You do have a precipitation of calcium carbonate, but it originated as a low LSI violation. And that's the kind of problems that we see in winterization. We didn't prep the water for the winter. We didn't feed that bear before it hibernated. So it fed itself on your pool, meaning it stole calcium from your cement. And whether that materialized as winter dust or calcium crystals or pigment loss, or there's just a number of issues that you can see, it found balance on its own. That's the crux of the winterization problems. And there's other ones like the pool gets dirty and you get some algae, and it's just really hard for algae to grow in cold water, but we don't need to get into that. Water balance, LSI, is the crux of winterization problems.
Wow. That's it's so much involved with it. It's so cool. It's all about that LSI. I mean, so many things are about LSI.
It's our first pillar of proactive pool care. LSI balance year round. You have to prepare for where the temperature is going to be.
So we talked about the winterization, calcium. Can you touch on calcium crystals versus scale? Did we do that already?
Absolutely. So calcium crystals are still calcium carbonate, just like scale, but they originate from within the plaster. We've had several of these laboratory tested, and they, as the lab called it, skeletal calcite, which is calcium carbonate, but it grows. It doesn't deposit from the water and land on things. Scale's ugly. Scale just falls out of solution like sugar, and it sticks to things in the hottest places first, and it just kind of slops on there real ugly. Crystals, well, they're painful. They're not good, but if you look at them compared to scale, they're beautiful. These things grow. They look, sometimes they look absolutely gorgeous. Sometimes they're transparent. Sometimes they're pure white. They're sharp. They're a problem. I'm not saying I like them. I'm just saying aesthetically, they look very different from scale.
It's like growing crystals back in the day when we had those little experiment kits
with the sugar and the string. Yeah, exactly.
You make the crystals. So it looked really pretty. We're not saying it's good. We're just saying it looks pretty.
Yeah, it does. It does. And there's a lot of different types of crystals. And so we were working with NESPA and the National Plasterers Council a couple of years ago, trying to figure out this crystal problem. And we don't know all the answers, which is why we've encouraged people that have them to collect samples. If you're listening to this and you're in the Northeast or the Midwest, if you do have these crystals, please collect samples in a Ziploc bag and send them in for laboratory testing. Because we at Orenda did our own testing prior to that initiative, and we tested several samples, I think 6 or 7 different samples. And we know of 4 different types of crystals, and we have no idea why they're so different. And some of them are very easy to get rid of. Others, you have to drain your pool and physically grind them off. Even an acid wash won't make them budge. Even though we know they're calcium carbonate, for some reason, here's another one. You can break some of these off. You could acid wash it, doesn't do anything. Break them off and they'll fizz no problem in acid. Why?
Oh, wow.
We have no idea. We have no explanation for that. You would think acid would dissolve them. That particular type, no. But the other ones, they go away, no problem. We've literally done ones in the spring where they put in our SC1000, our chelating agent, when the water gets warm enough, And then they add a lot of calcium hardness. Actually, they pre-chelate that calcium hardness. That's how they add it. And literally the crystals just go away or they just fall off. We have no explanation for why those crystals are so easy to get rid of and the other ones are not. It's very hard to tell, but we do know they're growing. There's no doubt about that. When you look in an electron microscope, there's actually hollow tunnels inside each and every one of these little crystals, showing that it's kind of like a volcano. Actually, it's calcium hydroxide leaving, and then it's carbonating as soon as it hits the water. I'll show you a picture if you want me to share my screen. It's really wild.
Yes.
For those of you
Go ahead,
watching on here.
Yeah, if the listeners are listening and you want to see the video version, you can go to the YouTube channel for Space Coast Pool School, where the video version will be up. If you really want to see Eric Knight in visually and see his screen, he's bringing up now so that we can see what he's talking about with the calcium crystals.
So this is a stereo microscope. Now, what we're doing is we're looking at a very zoomed in version of these calcite crystals. And you could see a hollow channel inside each one of them.
Yep.
And that's showing that these things are growing. This is an electron microscope showing it's skeletal calcite. Scale doesn't look like that. This is what those same crystals look like, zoomed in, but they're about the size of your fingernail in this case. Now, a lot of it looks like 10 grit sandpaper, but these things grow in very different shapes, and there's a lot of different styles of them. So these are not scale. They are calcium carbonate, but they're not scale, and they were not formed the same way that scale was formed. And that's what we have to really remember. We have to balance LSI and prepare our water for its coldest temperature.
And how did you discover this?
Kind of by accident, actually, where I was on a trip in the Northeast and got into Pennsylvania and met a really nice couple who owns a pool service company in Pennsylvania, and they had scale. And we met them through one of the sales guys at a distribution center. And we were told scale. They have scale. Well, it was actually crystals. And this is when it was kind of discovered, because I'm thinking, how could scale form in cold water? And at the time, we had just released the Orenda app months before, and we didn't even know at Orenda how important temperature was until we made our own app. We thought the LSI was just cool. Why not have it on the app? We had no idea it was going to change everything. But when we figured out what temperature did, by playing with our own app and double checking, are we sure that our algorithm is right, that this is a correct calculator? And come to find out, yes, it is. Oh my God. Water temperature is a huge factor that's being neglected, and nobody's talking about it. And so I knew by the time I had met this business owner that water temperature, you're not going to have scale in cold water. I mean, you would have to have so much calcium hardness and so much alkalinity and such a high pH to overcome that cold water. It's just not going to happen. What really made more sense, and this is where I was scratching my head, like, this is a round tile. It's not on fittings. It's not on anything plastic. Scale can't do that. So number one, I know it's not scale visually. Number two, chemically, it doesn't make sense. So what am I looking at? So we started collecting samples, and I said, it sounds like you're losing calcium hydroxide. I had just never heard of crystals at the time. So what's happening is they are, yes, my instincts were correct in that we've done all this laboratory testing post facto that, yes, they are losing calcium hydroxide, but it's carbonating as they're losing it. And that's what's forming the crystals. So they're hitting this water that has carbon and alkalinity or carbon dioxide in it. And that's what's crystallizing it as it's coming out. So what you're really looking at, Lauren, is etching in super slow motion.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
It is kind of cool. It's also kind of scary to think that surface was a $10,000 pebble finish or whatever it is, and it's getting gnawed away. Now, granted, these are microscopic things. It's not going to ruin your pool surface if this happens one winter, because it won't. It's just not that much material. But it's not good either, right? You don't want this stuff. It's sharp enough to cut people's skin. You don't want it. And there's a very foolproof way to prevent it. We're batting 1,000 on this. Winterize ahead of time for the LSI at the coldest temperature possible. That's it. I don't care if I don't know all the science of what's causing these crystals or what's in every single type. And you're right. We do not know how to fix all types of crystals because we don't even know if there's more than 4. We presume there are. but we do know how to stop 100% of them. And it's worked every single time. So winterize with the LSI, and that's really what matters.
So that was leading into my next question with you. What does a good proactive winterization look like? What would Orenda say is the proper way?
Well, that's a great question. And that depends on a few factors. It depends on where you're located. So I live in the Carolinas now. I'm from the DC area in Northern Virginia. Pools up there freeze every year. You might get lucky one year and it doesn't quite freeze, but pretty much pools freeze every year. Once you get into Maryland and north, it freezes every year, pretty much guaranteed. So assume the worst. What is the coldest your water can possibly get? Now, Texas this year, as we all know just recently, got blown out with freeze damage because they lost power. So freeze protection failed. Pipes ruptured, heaters exploded, filters cracked because everything got frozen. They were not expecting that. And why would they? Houston doesn't freeze usually, right? It was a freak thing that happened. Got it. You don't have that excuse in New York. Your pools are going to freeze. Okay. They're just going to. Michigan, they're going to freeze. So you have to know where you're located and you have to know how cold is your water going to get. I would argue that those colder climates have a distinct advantage over the Carolinas or Tennessee or Alabama in winterization because they know they're going to freeze.
Yep.
The end game is conclusive. It's going to get to 32 degrees, period. It's just a matter of how fast. Well, they can winterize based on 32 degrees, no problem. I can't necessarily do that in Charlotte, but I choose to get close. So I winterize in Charlotte based on 35 to 38 degrees. Okay. I don't think it's going to get much colder than that. If it does, well, we're very close to it and you're going to have very minimal damage. You don't necessarily have to go. But the other factor that's going to go into this, there's two. The type of pool surface, i.e. cement-based, vinyl liner, or fiberglass, versus the type of cover you have. And we actually just published a blog on our Orenda blog about the importance of covers in winterization. The cover actually matters more than the type of surface. So if you have and seriously, it does. And the reason for that is carbon dioxide dictating where the pH of your water is going to be in terms of how it rises or falls. Mm-hmm. If you have a solid cover, two things are different than a mesh cover or no cover. A solid cover is going to prevent the loss of CO2, which means it suppresses your pH. We got an article about that. It's Henry's Law of Physics. The other thing is it stops dilution from coming in unless you have one of those hatches that allows water to flood in. And not all of them do. So if you don't have dilution from rain and snow, Lauren, pop quiz, how much calcium hardness is in rain and snow?
I honestly wouldn't know.
Zero.
Wow.
Rain and snow come from the sky. Minerals don't evaporate. It's distilled water that's landing on us. Now, the pH ranges depending on where you live, but there is no calcium. So if you plug that into the LSI app, you're going to notice rain and snow are really red. They're very, very low on LSI and they dilute numbers down. So if you have a mesh cover, you have to factor in dilution, but, and this is a big but, you get a benefit of the loss of CO2 to raise your pH and protect you in the wintertime. So your pH is going to stabilize with the atmosphere above it based on CO2 equilibrium. You don't get that luxury if you have a solid cover. So back to the surfaces, you don't have the correction mechanism in vinyl liners or fiberglass, but you do in a cement pool. So the consequences are different. We've got articles about all this. We could talk for hours, as you can tell, but it is fascinating to me that when somebody like a homeowner calls our hotline and they say, well, I've got this problem with my pool. Based on the problem, I'm usually going to be able to guess, okay, you have a mesh cover, a pebble or a cement-based surface, and you closed with calcium hardness somewhere around 300 or less. And usually I'm right, just because we've done it so much now that the symptoms are the same, no matter where they live. And you have to know those factors. So back to it, now that I've given context, talking too much. The proactive winterization has two things to it. You have to make sure that you maintain LSI balance all through the winter. That's the hard part. And we're going to spend most of our time talking about how to do that. And I'm going to share my screen. If you're listening to this, download the Orenda app. It's totally free, Orenda. And that app is what we're going to be going through. And I'm going to show you how to winterize it step by step. That's water balance. But you also have sanitization. Fortunately, germs and algae, they don't really grow well in cold water, but they can survive it. They're not just going to die in cold water. They can survive it, and they'll come back when the water gets warm usually. So you got to close properly chemically, with a chlorinated shock. We use a phosphate remover to get the nutrients out before the winter time, and we use an enzyme to clean out the sort of the guts of the system, the plumbing, the things that you can't see. If you get all those things out before you winterize, you have a very good chance of opening in the spring to a clean pool.
Yay.
If you don't, yeah, exactly. Yeah, clean pools are great. Nobody likes opening up to swamp water, and it happens a lot. So I'm going to share my screen and show you sort of how we would do it. So again, for the audio listeners here, I'm going to try to be as descriptive as I can, but I'm sharing my screen through the power of Zoom, and you're looking at my phone screen. So I'm going to go ahead and go on.
This is the fun part, guys.
Yeah. So I'm going to go on airplane mode just to not get phone calls in the middle of this. So right here, I have on the current levels, I'm showing my water chemistry in this example, perfectly LSI balanced water. Now, there's only one number on this screen, Lauren, that water actually cares about, and that's the LSI at the bottom. We have been taught in this industry that we have to think about, you have to have a pH between 7.4 and 7.6. Nobody bothered telling us that that's physically impossible to maintain unless you continue to add acid. Nobody explained Henry's law of physics that CO2 has to leave water to equalize with the air above it. Therefore, your pH rises. It's as guaranteed as gravity. But what we do need to know is the holistic aggregate of our water chemistry. And that's what the LSI is. It's the aggregate index of 6 factors: water temperature, pH, calcium hardness, carbonate alkalinity, which has a factor to correct for cyanuric acid, and total dissolved solids, including salt. So on this screen, I have 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 7.6 pH, 300 parts calcium, 90 parts alkalinity, 40 parts cyanuric acid or CYA, and 1200 TDS. And I have 0.00 perfect LSI water. Now, if you want to know the color code on here, you could tap this little question mark by LSI, and this explains what these colors mean. Purple, you would be oversaturated, you have scale forming, etc. So you basically want to stay yellow or green throughout the year. You want to avoid red. Red is bad. Water's going to be hungry. So watch what I do here. All I'm going to do here, Lauren, is change the temperature from 80 degrees down to, I don't know, let's say 40. Now look at what happened here. The temperature continues to go down, and at 47, I start to etch. Now, I'm going to tell you, most places, even in northern Florida, can get down to 47 at least one day, unless they're heated. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that.
Southern California can get into the 40s. It's usually going to stay in the 50s in the wintertime, but it can get down into the 40s. But most of the country is going to be able to get down here. Now, for those of us in a colder climate, that pool is going to be etching. And it's not going to be etching forever, because if it's a plaster pool, it's going to correct itself at the expense of your surface. But if you're in a fiberglass pool, there is no correction mechanism. You just have hangry water for months gnawing away at your gel coat. That's going to lead to chalking. That's going to lead to a deteriorated finish. It always does. So the question then, Lauren, is how do we correct this? How do we get the number on the right to be green at 32 degrees? Do you have any suggestions?
I'm going to leave it up to you to show us the right way to do it, Eric.
Okay, well, let's, how about you give me some parameters? Number one, does this pool have a cover?
I was going to ask, because we've talked about covers. So does this pool have a cover? Let's say
Make it
has, can I make up whatever cover I want?
Absolutely.
Let's do a hard cover.
Okay, so this is a solid cover, not a mesh cover. Okay,
Correct.
So a solid cover is not going to let that pH rise, because it's going to be locking in CO2, so CO2 cannot leave. Therefore, you've changed it. Just like capping a beer, you keep a compression of CO2 in there.
And you're not getting dilution because there's no snow or rainwater getting in.
Correct. So in that sense, I don't necessarily want to go sky high with my calcium, and I can't really raise my pH unless I aerate before I cover it up, which is the appropriate thing to do. So what I'd like to do on winterization is actually add sodium bicarb before I winterize. And the reason I want to do that is because I want that slight bump in pH. Let's say I can get it to 7.8 while I raise my alkalinity to, say, I don't know, 120 or 130. Now, I don't need to go crazy with this because too much alkalinity is going to bring up your pH too much. But let's just say I go to 130. Now, right there, I'm not etching anymore. I am in the yellow. I don't necessarily want to be in the yellow. I really want to be in the green. So I would also say you want more than 300. My minimum, Eric Knight's opinion, Orenda shares this opinion just because our research shows that it makes a lot of sense. If your pool freezes, no matter where you are, if your pool freezes, the minimum calcium hardness that you need in the wintertime is 400. And that's the bare minimum. Now, we can do 400 with a solid cover pool, which puts us right into the green, smack dab where we want to be. We can do that, but you don't want to add calcium chloride and bicarb on the same day. They don't play nice together. So you want to kind of divide that up, maybe 2 visits before and then 1 visit before. But you don't have to fight with dilution with this solid cover, Lauren. So you can get away with just leaving it at 400. But if you had a mesh cover or no cover, you really need to winterize with a lot more than that, probably 550 or 600, because rain and snow, here again, dilute that water down. Absolutely, they do. So it changes your LSI. So how many gallons is this pool?
Let's say it's a residential pool and it's like 12,000 gallons.
12,000. Oh, you're a Florida girl. Up in the Northeast, they don't make 12,000 very often. How about we do something more like 25,000?
Okay.
So they have bigger pools because they don't get to use them as much. So you might as well go big or go home. So here's the dosage. Now, it shows 13 ounces of soda ash. You don't necessarily have to do that. In fact, I would say do not do that because you're making an alkalinity correction. Just use sodium bicarb. Follow that 14.69 pounds of sodium bicarb. Ignore the soda ash. This is just a calculator that tells you how to get from left to right. It does not tell you, or it doesn't know that you're trying to do 2 things concurrently. It's not quite that smart. I wish it were, but we're a chemical company. We're not a tech company. Maybe it's possible, but we don't have it that way. Increased calcium, depending on the type you use, it's about 30 pounds. If you have 94% prill or granular, it's 26 pounds. That's what this pool is going to need in order to be LSI balanced at 32 degrees. Now, the next question, and by the way, there's this envelope at the top. You can email it to your service technician if you're a homeowner listening to this, or if you are a pro, you can email it to the homeowner, letting them know how you winterized. But the next question is, okay, I'm going to add all this calcium and alkalinity, but I'm winterizing in the first week of October or the last week of September. The water's not 32 degrees at that time. And you would be correct. It's not. You might be scale forming when you do that. So let's say it's more like 65 degrees at that time. Oh no, it looks like you're scaling if you add all of that up. But don't freak out about this. Look at that number, 0.37 in the purple. The way that this goes is 0.30 is still perfectly fine. The farther you are above that, the more likely you are to have scale, the faster it goes. 0.37 is not so bad.
It's not that bad.
It's really not that bad at all. In fact, minimal scale, if any. And by the way, since it was just precipitated, if that water does get colder, it needs calcium carbonate. It's probably just going to take that scale right back into solution. Mm-hmm. If you can scale your pool in the winter, if you're going to air anywhere, air high, scale it up, because it's kind of like armor. You can always clean it up. It doesn't damage anything except our feelings. So we don't want to freak out about a purple number going into the wintertime, although the better alternative is to ease your pool into winter. Don't necessarily do this all in the last week of September. If you can do a once a month visit and ease it in and keep gradually adding calcium each month, that is a much better solution to ease your way into winter. And by the way, ease yourself out of winter and ease yourself into the spring by gradually checking the chemistry, warming up the sample before you test it, checking the temperature every single visit, and you can work your way in and out of winter proactively. That, in a 17-minute explanation, is how you proactively winterize. So,
you know what? They always say good things come with time. So
I guess so.
sounds like proactively winterizing your pool is the same way, especially if you can make those visits and ease it in.
For sure.
Instead doing it all at one time, trying to cram for a test versus studying the whole time for it.
Mm-hmm.
Studying the whole time for it's going to make it a lot easier than trying to cram the night before.
Oh, absolutely.
We don't want to cram our pool into winterization.
Right. Well, once you do it once, it's actually a lot simpler than it sounds, because this is, if you've never heard of this is all a big change. But if you understand the LSI, it makes perfect sense. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it. You don't have to follow my numbers. Just use the calculator, play around with it. It is simpler than I made it sound, just because if you're unfamiliar with it, it's all new.
Is there anything else you'd like to add as we're getting to the tail end here?
Well, sure. I would say every week throughout the year, as a service professional or a pool owner, you need to be looking at the water temperature. If you do not have a thermometer in every single pool that you service or the pool that you own, get one. They cost less than $10. They're on a string. They're analog. It's the most accurate testing equipment we have in our industry is a thermometer. It's so proven. You have to know your temperature. Do not assume. How cold is cold? Do not assume you know what the water temperature is. If you don't know that, you're shooting blind, and equipment can get damaged from this. It is a huge problem. So don't be focused so much on trying to maintain these pH ranges, because realistically, 7.4 pH when your water's 50 degrees is completely unnecessary. Number one, you're not chlorinating anyway. Your water's too cold. Even if you're adding chlorine, it's not effective. It's way too slow. So why even try to have a 7.4 pH? You should be focused on the LSI. And we could talk all about cyanuric acid and chlorine and all that stuff later, but we've got a ton more information on our blog, in our app. So if you have more questions, just reach out.
And where can they find your website? Where they can get your blog and all that?
Oh, yeah, sure. It's orendatech.com. That's ORENDATECH.com. And the app is just called Orenda. And all the articles, all the videos are actually native in the app as well. So you just go to articles in the main menu or videos. They're all there, and you can share them with people. So if you see an article that your neighbor needs to hear about, or your coworker or whatever, just tap that share button. You can text it, email it, whatever you need to do. All that information is in there for you.
And if you definitely want to learn more about water balance and the things that we talked about on the podcast episode today, they have free training as well. Mm-hmm. Orenda, can you tell us a little bit about your free training?
Sure. We have two different forms of free training. We have Orenda Academy, which is a online virtual training module with 2 to 3 hours worth of videos. They're all short videos, but they have quizzes along the way. You go at your own pace. It'll remember where you left off. And you can go through Orenda Academy. And then we have our more advanced Orenda Academy 4 pillars. The first pillar of which is exactly what we talked about today. I only scratched the surface today, but it's LSI balance. So all that information is totally free. All you got to do is sign up. You can sign up directly through the app or on the website. You can't miss it. There's huge buttons for it all over our site. But you know, there's been, last we checked, over 15,000 people have taken it. So it's cool to be in the industry and producing good content.
So if you're looking for free training that's easy to access, and what we've talked about today, like you said, scratches the surface, and you want to definitely know more and see more of Eric Knight and some of the other people from Orenda, the training's very entertaining. I've taken it myself, and you'll learn so much about water balance, water chemistry, in many hours worth. And it's pre-recorded. And if I remember right, it was even easy to access through the app on the phone. So those of you that are mobile and you're thinking, I'm never going to have the time to do it, you could actually listen to it while you're driving from pool to pool.
And we have our podcast too, and it's just called Rule Your Pool. If you want to take a deeper dive, that's for those who want to listen while they work. Again, totally free. I think podcasts are great, and that's why I'm honored to be on yours. Happy to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being on my podcast today, and you have a wonderful day, Eric.
You too, Lauren. Thank you.